And we are recording with Mr. Dick Russell on Sunday, July 23rd, 2023 at 4:07 p.m. Eastern Time to talk about your book, The Real RFK Jr. The link to that book will be in the description. You can buy it on Audible. And I think the first thing is I would have to first do all the good deeds, but I hope one day somebody writes a book called The Real Tommy Carrigan that puts me in the same golden shining light as this book puts RFK in. And just fantastically well done. And really, as we were just talking about beforehand, boils down to getting quiet, listening to God, and finding that very gentle thread and it telling you which way to go. But with that, Dick, could you please introduce yourself, sir?
Yeah, Tommy, thanks very much for having me on your podcast. I'm a writer. That's pretty much all I've ever done. And I've tried my hand at carpentry for a couple of years, and that didn't work out so good. So the only thing I really know how to do is what I've been doing. And started out as a sports writer years ago. I was with Sports Illustrated magazine. That was my first job out of college, and then over time I've branched out, into first of all I worked for TV Guide magazine as a staff writer for a while in the late '70s, and then I got into the environment and wrote dozens of articles on environmental issues in the '80s and '90s. And in recent years, I've been doing books, and I've done 15 now. Starting in 1992 with one about the Kennedy assassination called "The Man Who Knew Too Much," and then lots of different subjects since then. So we can talk about all that if you want. But my latest is, yeah, The Real RFK Jr. Trials of a Truth Warrior, came out about a month ago now, and I'm really hoping that your listeners will pick it up. I mean, it's an attempt to really show who this guy is, who I've known for a long time. I've known Bobby since 1998. We're friends. We've worked together on different things, but he didn't, ask me to do this biography. And I started working on it about a year ago because I was just so upset with the profiles of him in the media and the censorship that he was undergoing for his controversial views, I guess you'd say, on public health issues, including what was going on with the coronavirus and in the pandemic. And so, he had an amazing environmental record, as probably a lot of your listeners may know. But I mean, just incredible. He was the top environmental lawyer in this country for years and years, and that's how I got to know him. And I wanted to get across not just that, but where he came from, how he became the man who's today running for president of the United States as a Democrat. And that wasn't happening when I started the book. This is not a
Mm-hmm.
campaign endorsement book or something. I think it's a real portrait of him, though, and of somebody that, yeah, admittedly, I greatly admire.
I think I do like the humanizing aspects of it. And I think his battle with substances and getting into sobriety is probably the thing that can allow us other mortal humans who aren't, don't have the last name Kennedy, but you can still identify with it. And how you don't want to change if you don't have to.
Right.
If you're flying high, you don't have to. But he mentions, or you mention, kind of the little things of, if I wake up 5 minutes before the alarm, do I get up now, or do I sit there with my thoughts? If I take a shirt off the coat hanger and one of the metal ones falls from the ground, do I slam the closet door shut and go, that's, I'm above that. That's for someone else to pick up, or another time. And these things that you wouldn't really expect to come from a discussion about sobriety, but nonetheless, it does sort of, know God and be still and know that I am God. And from that, all things flourish in a manner that really polishes every aspect of your life. Could you maybe touch on that a little more?
Yeah, I mean, it's a central part of the book of the real RFK Jr. and a part that he really wanted emphasized because he's really been through it. I mean, you could imagine he was 15 years old when his father was killed. He was 10 when his uncle was assassinated. And obviously the whole family was devastated by this. He had, 10 brothers and sisters, and it was tough for all of them, but he really went through it. I mean, through a long period of anguish, and He was a mess, and he took off when he was like 16, traveled, went out to the West Coast, started just hopping freight trains with
Mm.
hobos,
Yeah.
cooking with them, and then, outside and went to Haight-Ashbury back in the days of the hippies. I mean, and he didn't want anybody to know even who he was. He didn't come out as a Kennedy. He was like, I'm just this guy, who's really screwed up like you are, and
Yeah.
I want to get to know you. And then he was lucky. He had a mentor, a man named Lem Billings, an older man who had been very close to his uncle. They to JFK. They'd gone to school together at Choate, back in the 1930s. And Lem was very close to the family. Had, spent lots of time in the White House when JFK was president. And when Robert Kennedy, his father, was killed, he really took Bobby Jr. under his wing, and I think probably saved his life. I mean, he took him to East Africa, on the Serengeti Plain there, because Bobby loved animals. I mean, he'd grown up, wanted to be a veterinarian,
Mhm.
and surrounded by animals and raising falcons, and then Lim had a ranch in Colombia, so he brought Bobby there 2 summers in a row to live, among indigenous people and just, get to know what that was like. So, as tough as it was for him, it was also really the beginnings of an education in a whole new way than he'd had growing up. And he also, at the same time, he was a very high functioning drug addict.
Yeah.
And, he was going into Harlem to score heroin, survived all that. 1983, which is like after 14 years of this, he just about OD'd on an airplane. And he went into rehab and had what the kinds of experiences that you describe. He discovered, he had a lot of interesting synchronicities, but he discovered a psychologist that people may have heard of probably, named Carl Jung.
Mhm.
And he read his work and thought about how, kind of the magic of life and things that present themselves to you, and you make these choices. You go with it or not? And among those were just the kinds of things you described, and they were very simple things in life that he realized that he had just never paid much attention to when he was growing up, and probably never had to. But he went into AA, and he has stayed in AA all these years and still goes to meetings on a regular basis. I mean, more than once a week, sometimes every day. He knows that if he didn't have that, it could be easy for him to slip back. He's been sober ever since. And in the course of that, he's really helped a lot of people. I mean, probably thousands, who've heard him speak at these meetings. It's all anonymous. So, he's just another guy, but he's had quite an experience to talk about. And he's been willing to do it. And, you think about what's going on in the country today. I think 100,000 kids died last year of fentanyl overdoses. And, I don't think there's anybody who's been to the bottom like he has and is more qualified in a political, you know, establishment way that could address the crisis and help parents and young people who are in that situation.
Beautifully said. And there's some similarities. There was a book, I think it was 2018. I read it 2019. I never finished it, but it was about FDR. And I need to
Mm,
go back and finish it. It was like a 30-hour tome. And I've started a couple books like that over the years, and I have made a note to go back one by one and reconquer them and finish them. I think The Arms of Krupp, KL by Nicholas Voshman. So I will get back to that one and conquer it. But it's FDR kind of growing up in a pretty wealthy guy, and going to private school in Groton, Connecticut, and but always being instilled, from his parents to understand just how fortunate he was that
yeah,
that he didn't live a normal life. You know, a summer home in downtown Manhattan is not normal, right?
no,
And
it is.
especially in like 1905 or whatever. Um, and you do kind of see that specifically the day his uncle was killed, when you say his father kind of meets with all of them and writes them a letter and says, remember all the great things about him and
Yeah.
understand that I think his father, RFK, is saying like, I've really never known a bad day until now.
Hmm.
Could you maybe illuminate on that, where it's you do, and not to make a political connection, because I'm sure some people love FDR and some people hate him. That's not the point. But there is that similarity between understanding that, it is a dynastic family,
Yeah.
and he was raised in a manner that he was to understand that.
Yeah, and he was raised in a manner that he never forgot, in the sense that, you know, he's a fierce advocate for free speech and debate today, and he's been a victim, as we can talk about later, of unbelievable censorship. But at the same time, when he grew up, they would sit around the dinner table every night, and his father would encourage these basically, verbal fights.
Mm,
Let's take different sides of an issue, which his own Robert Kennedy, their father, Joseph Kennedy, had done when they were growing up. And they would, back then it was World War II, and okay, what about fascism? And what do you think of Mussolini? And should America get into this war? And then, when Bobby was young, the Vietnam War came up and was starting to be a big issue. And he wasn't quite draft age yet, but they talked about those things at the dinner table. And it's really interesting because it's like a family tradition in a sense that it's carried on, And when I know Bobby's kids. He has 6 kids, and I know all of them, some better than others, but they're all grown now. One of them, the youngest, is 21, and he does the same thing with them. And there's a really wild story, which is that Connor, who's his oldest son, and I've known Connor since he was, I don't know, 5 years old. And there's an interesting story about that too. But Connor had a very different view on the conflict, the war in Ukraine, than Bobby Jr. does, than his father does. And so they got into this at the dinner table. And eventually, Connor decided, he was in law school on the East Coast. He said, if I believe in this so strongly that, the people of Ukraine are suffering so badly, and this is a terrible thing that's happened, which it is, of course, but I mean, if he feels it that strongly, then he said, I'm going to do something about it. So he went and joined a foreign legion, basically. He went off and fought with the army in Ukraine. Never told the Ukrainian army. He never told his dad what he was going to do. All he said was, I'm going to disappear for a while. I know that you'll be concerned about me, but I'll be okay, I think, and I'll be back. So the only reason that Bobby Kennedy knew anything about this was they found these credit card bills from, not from Ukraine, but from, I don't know, Czechoslovakia or something. So they knew he was somewhere over there, and he went, and he knew how to shoot, and he became a machine gunner with one of those organizations. And then he showed up one day. He had a girlfriend in Brazil, I think, and he called his dad when he got back, and he said, "Dad, I was fighting with the Ukrainian army, and I'm back." And wow, his father said, "Oh, I'm glad you didn't tell me, you know, but I'm sure glad you came back, and I respect you greatly for what you did." So I don't know. It's just a story of this generational continuity that I think is it's really important part of the Kennedy family and who he is.
Could you maybe go into the importance that uh, Bobby places on the divisions in the United States? Because it's so easy to, as he always says, the leaders you can tap into our kind of darkest instincts, xenophobia, fear, hatred for the outside, anything that might dismantle our current way of life, versus the overwhelmingly massive number of similarities we have, from the farthest most left to the farthest most right person, that we really are destroying ourselves. No external enemy is doing a job that nearly as well as we're doing to ourselves.
Yeah.
And could you maybe touch on that, because he is really the only person. I mean, I think I love the when he's on that interview and they try to catch him into something like, something about Donald Trump, and he's basically like, I'm not going to speak ill of him. I'm not, you're not going to get me on these. He's like, he's a good man that's fighting for his country, and I'm fighting in a different way. But he's like, you're not going to pull me into just this mudslinging, because it gets us
Yeah.
nowhere, and it's what we've been doing forever. Could you maybe touch on that?
Oh, it's a huge reason. It's the reason really why he decided to run for president.
Hmm.
Um, like I say, he wasn't doing this when I started writing The Real RFK Jr. a year ago, but I was interviewing him a number of times, of course, as I was researching the book, and I already knew him. So, I'd go out to the house and we'd hang out, and he one day he said, he said, I've decided I knew that he had many opportunities when he was in younger years. He's 69 now, still in great shape though, by the way, and goes to the gym every day, and he's buff,
He's
right?
buff, yeah.
So anyway, uh, he'd had a lot of opportunities to run for office. As he could have been governor of New York or U.S. senator. I mean, a long time ago, and he never did it for different reasons. He had family things he was working out. He was raising these kids and trying to do it right, 6 kids, right? And but he told me, he said, he said, I think I'm gonna have to run for president as a Democrat. He said, because I don't see anybody else who knows enough about where the country's at and is willing to speak the truth about it that can bring people together at the same time, like I feel I can, is what he said. That's something like that. And so he announced in April, and the slogan of the campaign is "Heal the Divide," which means, you know, he said, I mean, he's talked about it, and we are in it. We're in the worst, you know, the least civil environment, the worst political climate that we've been in, since the Civil War. People on both sides can't talk to each other anymore, and they, accuse each other of everything, right? In the most vitriolic ways, and so he's somebody who, as I was researching the book, I realized how much he'd been able to get things done by working across party lines. That he was never a standard, I'm a liberal Democrat, that's it, guy. He worked, with Republican upstate farmers, to get the watershed agreement to happen in New York, a landmark agreement to protect the city's water supply. He worked with commercial fishermen on the Hudson River and farmers in North Carolina whose water was being poisoned and lots of, and he with another guy, he was a Republican businessman who had this big this natural gas company, right? He was the CEO of it, but he knew that the things weren't right. The safety of what's called fracking, from bringing these gases these wells, and that people were getting put on their water faucet. Sometimes they catch on fire, right? Remember the movie Gasland?
Mm.
Anyway, so he got together with this guy, and they got fracking banned in the state of New York. Again, working across party lines. So he knew how to do that because, I mean, you see now in the campaign, he's probably got more support from independents and even a lot of Republicans than he does so-called liberal Democrats who just who kind of the big media just feeds off each other and accuses him of being crazy, conspiracy theorist, anti-vaxxer is the big one, of course. And none of those things are true. And so, he's up against a lot, but he's somebody who he knows how divided the country is, and he knows that we're not going to make it as a democracy if that continues. So I hope that answers your question.
Mm. Um, he speaks towards the end of his interview with Joe Rogan about his father and his uncle dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and
Yeah,
how, I mean, they really were getting strong armed by Curtis LeMay, by the heads of the intelligence community, with no light suggestions. On the softest end, we need a full military invasion. On
yeah,
the other end, we got to hit it with a thermonuclear warhead or a couple. And didn't come out until the 90s that we found out that there were functioning warheads on there and that the Soviets had given the field commanders autonomy to use them. Would have been the end of the world.
yeah.
It
We
would
wouldn't
have,
be here.
it absolutely 62 would absolutely have escalated till full. I think we were doing Operation Chrome Dome at the time. Our bombers would have gone right into Soviet territory. Their
Oh
subs
yeah,
would have come off the east and west. It would be the end of the world, period.
yep,
And cooler heads prevailed. And by cooler heads, I mean JFK and RFK.
yep,
He talks towards the end of Rogan's interview about what is going on with Ukraine, but also saying that we have to understand, you have to take a cold, hard look at the permanent war industry in this country. And they're never going to present a war. And I'm not making light of what's going on in Ukraine. I've interviewed refugees. I get it. I get that. I don't get it. Right. I've lived a life of wonder and opportunity in this country, but they've never served up a war that looks bad. Right. Korea, not sure. Nam, sure, you're going to have, you know, kind of opposition, or invasion of Afghanistan, invasion of Iraq. It's always served up in, like, if you're not for this, you're a pacifist, or you're
Mhm.
anti-American, or we
Yep.
got to go build schools for the boys of Baghdad, and that's not why we're there. That's not why we're there, and that doesn't mean that what's going on there isn't a sad, heartbreaking situation, but you have to understand just what is the dominant force in this country. And that's what sitting President Dwight D. Eisenhower said. It's the military industrial. And 30 years before him, you had Smedley Butler say it. So
Yep.
he said it's a war is a racket. You're doing it for, you're doing it for Wall Street. You're doing it for what are Dole banana, Dole fruit. Could you maybe go into his really, I think the only person to actually point out the 800-pound fire breathing elephant in the room of the military industrial complex.
Oh yeah, and he knows a lot about it. I mean,
Yeah.
firsthand from the time he was a kid, and he knows how close we came to annihilation and what it took. It also got his uncle killed by these forces within the military-industrial complex that wanted to maintain the status quo and actually believed themselves, of course, wrongly, that JFK was a traitor for trying to make peace. With the first say, no, we're not okay. We're not going to invade Cuba. We're not going to try and get rid of Castro. The CIA had been trying to kill Castro, and Kennedys were aware of this in the beginning of his administration. And also, we're gonna do something with Khrushchev and the Russians. And JFK made this amazing speech at American University in the summer of '63 that outlawed nuclear testing in the atmosphere. That was another thing. If we'd continued to have that, can you imagine the air that we'd be breathing today? I mean, we wouldn't. We might not be. So they did these things, and young Bobby was aware of it and has also studied that era a lot, in the years since. And so he doesn't come out of nowhere on this, and he knows that the military industrial complex is as strong, if not stronger, than in a sense it ever was. We may not have as crazy people as Curtis LeMay all the time, but it's still in control. There is a deep state in a sense that is controlling a lot of things, and he just feels like the Democratic Party, and I think he's right, has gotten so far away from the values and the peace, generation that the Kennedy family represented in the 1960s. I mean, here we are, pouring, billions of dollars into the Ukraine situation. Bobby feels, if he was president, he could bring or maybe not just he, but the Russians would come to the table. They wanted to in the beginning, and it was actually the U.S., according to what Bobby has spoken about, that sort of escalated the conflict and allowed it to continue. First of all, by putting all these NATO troops, which we said we'd never do, through 14 different countries close to the Russian border. So it's not that Putin was justified, and Bobby Kennedy does not, think Putin's a great man or something. I mean, he knows he's a maniacal guy, but at the same time, he would talk to him. And just like, he was very upset not too long ago that we weren't talking to the Chinese. Now that's begun to change a little bit recently with Secretary of State Blinken going over there and talking to Premier Xi and like that. But it's all about kind of dialogue, because it was really in the missile crisis, the secret for many, many years, the correspondence between
Mm-hmm.
Premier Khrushchev and President Kennedy and the relationship that they developed that led to the possibility that they could head off nuclear holocaust. And they did. And they, when JFK was assassinated, the stories are that Khrushchev just broke down and wept.
Mm.
And then Jackie Kennedy wrote a beautiful letter to Khrushchev of appreciation about, what their relationship had been. Khrushchev didn't make it that long either. I mean, he was deposed by those military people in his own country by the fall of 1964. So, this is a situation that existed then, and I just think that there's a lot to be said for the kind of overtures for peace that Kennedy, would at least try to make, and like his uncle and his father did. I mean, his father came into the presidential race in 1968, was given no chance initially. He challenged a sitting president at the time, LBJ, who had escalated the Vietnam War to 500,000 Americans over there. And Eugene McCarthy had come in to protest that. But then suddenly Bobby entered the race, and when he won the California primary the night he was killed, he would likely have been the next president of the United States, and we'd have a very different country today if he'd won.
One of the reasons why I love RFK Jr. so much is kind of everything you just mentioned. He is more aware of the forces at play, and he doesn't sugarcoat it. It's
No,
not, you'll hear some politicians be like, well, listen, the deep state's a conspiracy. Sure, there are entrenched interests. Oh, he'll
yeah,
straight up say on an interview, like, the Central Intelligence Agency killed my father and my uncle.
what he's been doing.
Just dead, look you dead in the eye, like feet planted, like that's what they did.
Yep.
And I think the average person is more aware of that now. I mean, I think it was, it was one of those, I can't remember his name. You'd see some, what's his name? Some pseudoscience, not pseudoscience, but kind of Sam Harris. I think he said on an interview, he was like, he's like, Bobby Kennedy said that the CIA killed his father. He's like, this is a kind of guy we're dealing with who believes this stuff. And it's like,
Well, it's
dog,
true.
anyone with a functioning brain looks at this and goes, yes, of
Yeah.
course he was. He absolutely was. How much of, so this is kind of why I admire him. And I don't even really know if there's a question here, if it's just a statement, but that's why I admire him. Is it's not this rosy, like, we're going to go do it and take the hill and it's all going to, I mean, he's looking into the jaws of death,
Yeah.
at an $800 billion a year military industrial intelligence pharma complex. He's just about stepped on every toe imaginable, right? He's gone out of his way to anger them all, and he's still just walking directly into the hellfire. Kid,
Yeah.
again, I don't really know if there's a question in there. I think it's just my own admiration, if you want to riff on that.
Yeah. Well, for sure. I mean, I think there's a couple things I'd like to say about that.
Sure.
Well, one is that they're, I think the establishment is terrified of him because they haven't seen anybody come along like this who he doesn't really have political ties in a sense. I mean, he's never been in held public office. So in that sense, he's free of all those kinds of things. Of course, he has to raise a lot of money to run for president, which he's doing, but he's raising it from people who are seeing that this guy he's willing to tell the truth and take risks, put himself out there, for what he sees as happened. And of course, it does go back to the assassinations of his uncle and his father, initially. And I know a lot about those too. I wrote several books on the assassination of President Kennedy before I knew Bobby. I mean, it wasn't like that was the basis of our friendship. We
Sure.
were working together around the environment, uh, but I know a lot about it, and we've talked about it in recent years. For a long time, I never even brought up the subject because this wasn't, like I say, it wasn't our relationship. We were working on environmental issues together, and I didn't know how he felt about it. And in fact, until I think around 2008 or 2009, he read a book, not my book, but the book by Jim Douglas called JFK and the Unspeakable, and it laid out what that era was about in the early 60s when President Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy made so many enemies because they were changing the status quo,
Mm.
and because interestingly JFK was started out as a real cold warrior, and then he was willing to grow in office, to change, to see that there was something bigger than his ideologies that he'd held on to about the Cold War. So I think Bobby Kennedy Jr. has this as well, and when he's not afraid to talk about it, and it's true. I'll briefly mention the assassination of his father too, because he took a really huge step. You think about this. few years ago. Remember the day he told me he was going to do it? We were out together, and he said, "I'm going to go see Sirhan in prison tomorrow." And I said, "Wow." I mean, I was speechless because
Yeah.
Sirhan's the accused murderer of his father, right? And they were going to go see. He was going to go see him, and he did. And he already knew a lot about this, but when he met Sirhan, first of all, Sirhan was terribly regretful that he was in the pantry that night in the Ambassador Hotel. He did fire shots, there's no doubt about it. He hit other people, including one of Bobby Kennedy's senior and junior's friends, Paul Schrade, who recently passed away. He was an amazing, union guy. But Sirhan did not kill his father. Sirhan fired from the front, and none of those bullets hit Senator Kennedy. He
Hmm.
was shot and killed from behind, and likely by a security guard, so
Hmm.
called, who was standing there. And Sirhan has no memory of going into
Yep.
that pantry, which is pretty interesting too, because another thing that people may have forgotten or don't even know about is that the CIA and in particular, but the military too, were doing experiments
Hmm.
starting right after World War II on how to create assassins
Yes.
through mind manipulation. Through it was called MK Ultra. That
Hmm.
was the program in the CIA, and it was how do you use hypnosis or drugs to influence people to do a dark deed and have no recollection of it. So is that what happened to Sirhan? I would argue yes.
Yeah.
And there's pretty good evidence that he was triggered by a code word by a girl in a polka dot dress in
Hmm.
that pantry that night that brought him into the kitchen where he just suddenly began to fire. And he had superhuman strength, by the way.
Mm.
Rayford Johnson and Roosevelt Greer, I think, talked about, they were like athletes, and they could not get the gun away from Sirhan. He was like, superhuman for a minute there. So it was a hypnotic command,
Mm.
and that's pretty scary stuff. And I think there's a lot of denial about that in the American general public and certainly in the media. They just don't want to go there, because if you start talking about that publicly, you got to question a lot of things that have happened in this country since.
It's an event horizon. It's a singularity that you approach.
Yeah,
And as comedian Tim Dillon, he's this funny fat guy who just also so happens to love like Cold War history. It's a great
mm,
blend. He's like, yeah, well, he goes, once you realize, he's talking about Sirhan, he goes, once you realize Sirhan has no recollection of it, at the same time they were doing things like MK Ultra, he goes, oh yeah, they might also start a fake war. They might overturn Roe v. Wade. He goes,
yeah,
they might be capable of this, but yeah, man,
that's not
it's a
funny.
dark closet that no one wants to look into because even the military industrial complex, that might take you a while, but people can warm up to it. They're like, all right, there's some money overlapping with military, overlapping with the State Department, and you knock over a government and then you got to rebuild it, and then the big multinationals. And some people, warm up to that. But the deeper you look into it, Mongoose, Monarch, MK Ultra, I mean, Poisoner in Chief about Sidney Gottlieb, or Blitzed by Norman Ohler. I mean, really going down the rabbit hole.
Yeah,
It's an odd, it's an odd place to go because Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by Dave McGowan. All these things, it starts to get like X-Files music where the military industrial complex starts to seem quaint. I mean,
mm,
it's all the same thing, but yeah, man, the things they were doing back then, and it didn't stop. That's another
no,
thing. Is we go the things they were doing back then, huh? Those were some silly guys, anyway. And it's like, no, no, no. Why would they have stopped? Why wouldn't they have perfected it?
yeah,
And that's a rabbit hole people don't want to go down. And then when an individual like myself or yourself goes down it,
it's
you start
dark.
talking out loud at a dinner party, and people start kind of looking away. And they're like, anyway,
Yeah,
so the Red Sox are on a real tear this year. And it's like, no, listen, they were giving psychedelics to foreign nationals to wipe their brains so they'd shoot, candidates. And it's like, all right, Tommy, we're gonna hit the
Yeah.
bars. You should maybe get a cab, right? But that's kind of what
Yeah,
happens. But
exactly. Yeah.
you have to examine it fearlessly. This is
Yeah.
what they were doing.
Yep. It was. And, and I guess the question arises with that. So when things that have happened are so dark and
Mm,
nefarious and evil, really, I mean, we're talking evil,
yeah.
then how do you still, see the light in a sense,
Yeah.
Well, I think first of all, the truth, I believe, can, this phrase, the truth can set you free, right? And if you shed light on these things in a real way, maybe there's a healing that can really take place. But as long as there's such denial of a coup d'etat that happened 60 years ago now, and a downward slide of this country into, where we are today, ever since the series of events, we don't have to go into all of them, but there is a pattern that you can see if you really start to study this history. And it's a grim pattern, but also, it's not hopeless. I mean, it's not hopeless because there's still something called, I don't know, called it's spirit, or maybe it's the American spirit. It's something that can be drawn upon and revitalized, and that I really honestly believe is what Robert Kennedy Jr. is trying to do.
Mm,
And what I try to show in the real RFK Jr. is examples of that. That he's shown through his environmental career and his willingness to really bring himself up. I mean, the guy has been to the bottom, and yet he sees a light. He sees something that could be again. That he's really moving into. Um, he's talking about the future. He's talking about our kids and our grandkids and what kind of a world in America are they going to live in, and drawing upon calls himself a Kennedy Democrat and drawing upon those values. He wrote a book called American Values. It's a wonderful book about what he learned from his family through the years, um, that he can impart, and try to get across, starting with the truth and looking at the hard truth about where we are as a country and what is our past really that has led to this place. And I think you gotta admire that. I certainly do.
absolutely. Yeah, no, I know. I've said it multiple times. I do. It's yeah, I think the silver lining in it is once you realize it's not just dark or greedy. Right, the military industrial complex is dark and greedy, but you understand it on some level. You're like, yeah, it's a racket, it's a cartel. Doesn't make it good, but that's
Mhm.
not necessarily anything new, right? You're like, yeah,
Right.
human greed going for money. It sure doesn't make it good, but you get it. Once you start and get into the, no pun intended, but the mind bending stuff of what they were doing,
Hmm.
it goes past greedy and cartels. Like this isn't like JP Morgan and like Rockefeller, like Standard Oil, like, oh, those robber barons.
Yeah.
This is, I mean, they talk about in Poisoner in Chief by, I think it's by, is it by Stephen Kinzer? I mean, they
Yeah.
talk about taking Viet Cong people and putting little like radio transceivers in like the base of their skull and trying to get them to fight each other, and it wouldn't work, so they would just throw them out of a plane. You're dealing
Yeah.
with evil. You're not dealing with, you're Scrooge McDuck, like, oh, he just wants even more gold. That pesky. No, it's like, oh no, we're kind of looking at Satan in so many ways. You look, and then when you realize what also they were doing is, well, a lot of it had to do with they would operate and they would test on kids from American like psychiatric wards.
Yeah.
You start to you are dealing with pure evil.
I'll tell you an interesting story about the poisoner in chief because I met him.
Oh, all right.
I interviewed Sidney Gottlieb
Oh, I'm jealous.
for the better part of a day. He lived in rural Virginia, and I didn't even know. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of dark people,
Hmm.
uh, because I investigated the Kennedy assassination, and I was looking into this whole horrible realm of mind control at the time, and he agreed to see me, and it was last years of his life. And what was really fascinating was that um, he had changed. I mean, in retire, he wasn't willing to tell me everything. That's for sure. I'm sure there's still a lot that he was obfuscating, right? But here, the guy became a Zen Buddhist. He started a biodynamic farm, the kind of the philosophy of the great Rudolf Steiner philosopher, and he lived communally for a while. I mean, he had, I'd have to say, I give him credit. I mean, he was a very changed person, which is interesting too, because he started off when he was first at CIA taking a lot of psychedelics. I mean,
Yeah,
he took LSD himself and then used it in a pretty bad way,
yeah.
as the CIA did with these drugging unsuspecting people and so on. But it was one of the more interesting interviews I ever did. Was spending that day with him, and he wouldn't. All he did was he raised the hypothetical with me. I
Mm.
wrote about this in one of my books on the trail of JFK assassins, and he raised the possibility that Oswald could have, been manipulated through hypnosis or whatever to assassinate JFK if he already had proclivity toward that. So, and I think he also knew that, and I'd interviewed some pretty well-known people in the world of hypnosis that the likelihood was that Sirhan, could have been one of these people, and this had emanated from what the CIA did. Not that Gottlieb did it himself, but
Sure.
anyway, that was a possibility.
Yeah. I guess the only good thing is once it moves from greedy oil guys to the face of pure evil, it kind of implies that there has to also be good because it's so evil. It's
Yeah,
so almost comically evil, like twiddling the mustache. Like we're gonna operate on children and make them shoot people. It's like it's
yeah,
almost like a poorly written like comic book villain. It then starts to force you to believe, well, there also must exist something else so
yeah,
far on the other end of the spectrum of
yeah.
just white knighthood or chivalry or an angel in human form. And
Does, doesn't it? Yeah, I would agree with that. And so you always gotta. I mean, I've been in at times in my life when I was looking into all that stuff that I finally had to just get away from it. I
oh, it'll
mean,
break you.
it was really dark, and it was affecting me internally, because it was suddenly, wow, satanic ritual abuse. I mean,
Yeah,
it's horrible stuff.
yeah,
And so I got away from it, and I've never really returned to it in an investigative way. Instead, I kind of this is just talking about myself, but I took up subjects like, let's save the gray whales,
yeah,
from an industrial salt works in Baja California that's going to threaten the habitat where they have come to have their young every year.
yeah,
Because somehow these whales are coming up to us, in a small boat on this same lagoon, 100 years after they were almost hunted to extinction there, and maybe they got a message for us.
mm,
And let's make sure that we protect that species. And then I traveled all the way, followed their migration all the way to Russia. So I moved, from the kinds of things we're talking about to, I guess, well, to certainly positive things that were happening that, people were coming together and working on, including Robert Kennedy Jr., who I got to know during that fight, that could actually make a difference, and that was successful. The salt works got stopped. I've been involved in a campaign to save a fish, the Atlantic striped bass, with a bunch of my friends who were summer fishermen. And hey, we did it. We shut down the fishery for a few years, and the fish came back.
yeah.
Those are the kind of things that I hope that the younger generation, will realize and take up in ways that, because we've got so many problems on this planet now, and but I'm encouraged by. I did a book on climate change and how the big oil companies covered everything up, right? Since they've known about this for 30, 40 years, or they're scientists, and they just buried it. ExxonMobil, for example. But now, you've got these lawsuits that are happening where kids in school are saying, I am being denied my right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness by the policies that are still going on. And we got to do something about this. And so, their voices are being heard, and young people like Greta Thunberg it becomes world famous, right, for her campaigns on that. So that's my hope of the future, and that's light stuff. That's
Yeah.
like you got to fight the forces, but there's possibilities of real change happening.
Well, it's also a way to keep your sanity. Right?
Exactly.
You gotta. It doesn't mean that you ignore the evil stuff, but it's take a fight you can handle,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Take
right.
take
And
take a
well,
fight you can
yeah,
handle. Be like, all right, we do need to deal with that. We do need to deal with the people using LSD on children to kill people. For now, though, you're like, I'm gonna tackle this,
yeah,
and that's how you make real change. You don't really make real change by looking at the worst thing and going, "We're going directly for the heart." It really doesn't. It makes for a good movie, but that's not really how it works. What you're saying, yeah, another book, The Franklin Scandal by Nick Bryant. I mean, you get into real satanic ritual. Another thing, like you say it out loud on the podcast, you can almost feel people like, ah, oh,
oh,
Tommy, don't go that way. But like
yeah,
satanic ritual abuse, man, Nick Bryan isn't a. That's not like a. It's not like a fantastical, like oh, it's here. That's a pretty cut and dry. I think he was a reporter for the BBC for like 20 years.
mm,
Man, that book about satanic ritual abuse, that's not. It's not colorful. It's very cut and dry, and you read the book and you pause every once in a while and you're like, what in God's name? Like here in the United States, like 40 years ago, like you think you're learning about like Salem witch trials, but
yeah,
you're reading about what they called it power meetings, and it was where this girl was like recollecting these guys they had like gold necklaces with like the faces of demons on them, and they would like rape these kids and like slit throats, and you're reading it and you're like, what am I? What am
it's
I even?
hard.
It's the heart. It's just it's the black eyes of death, and
Yeah,
it's hard to look at, but you also there is a burden of once you know about it, you have to do something about it. And I think back to the comedian Tim Dillon, I found out about this through Tim Dillon. He interviewed Nick Bryant years and years ago.
mm,
They get to the end and they're like, "So what do you realistically do?"
yeah,
And he goes, "Well, first thing you do with the disease is, or we could go back to, Alcoholics Anonymous. He goes, the first thing you do is you diagnose it and you go, we have a problem. That's the very first thing you do. He's like, I don't claim to know how we remove the military industrial complex and everything that goes with it. But at the very least, we have to start identifying it.
yeah,
And
yeah. And then putting real resources into it,
yeah,
like the in the pandemic, uh, I mean, 500 new billionaires were created, and the middle
yeah,
class pretty much disappeared. And all of these towns have, they boarded up their storefronts, and especially in the poorer communities, and they've never reopened. So I mean, I see it all the time, even just in my neighborhood in West Hollywood. I mean, uh, that a lot of places just shut down. That was it, and unnecessarily, I think. I don't think those lockdowns were necessary in the way that they happened. But neither here nor there. But I mean, I'm saying that there's resources that you could put into, which I would also think Robert Kennedy Jr. would do. He's talked about that a lot, to revitalize the middle class in this country, and put money into like if you legalized marijuana at a federal level. This is just a popped into my head example, but he's mentioned it. You could take that money, the tax money, and put that into real centers for kids to go to have not just rehabilitation, but the community gatherings, and the lack of community, I think, is so big. We're so split now in the country that and so material that people coming together to fight for things is almost an unnatural cause. But
yeah.
in many cases, I'm not across the board, but I think the sense of community is vital, and that also is something that Bobby's candidacy points toward.
Um, guess in the last couple minutes, is there anything you could maybe enlighten me or my audience about Bobby that we haven't touched on already?
I think that what I really admire about him is his moral courage, his ability to take risks, and even to have to accept, the fact that many of his family members have turned against him, or feel like he's wrong, I should say, for taking the stances he has on public health, and calling for safe vaccines, which he's not an anti-vaxxer per se. His kids are vaccinated. He went through years of being vaccinated himself. He didn't do the COVID vaccine himself, but he had reasons, which were he didn't feel he'd been safely tested. So on that front, and also on the fact that he would do things like go to visit Sirhan in prison, ooh, that really, hurts a lot of people in his family. They don't feel that's right. But, he knows that, and it's not that it doesn't affect him, but he still feels like he's gotta he's gotta go out there and fight for the truth of what he sees has to happen. And so I guess that's one thing I'd like people to know about him is that he embodies that moral courage that his father spoke about. And in a sense, I mean, it's his legacy.
Mm.
And he's always been the one of all those Robert Kennedy siblings that was always looked to as, oh, this guy, he could be our political leader sometime. He used to organize these amazing river trips, right, in South America. And he's a really good organizer, and he studies how to do things. I mean, he studied a lot of the science, and, behind what the vaccination issue and public health in general, and pointed out that our chronic health, uh, we're in a situation in the country where chronic diseases have risen more than 50% in the last 20, 30 years. And he's talked publicly and said, that's what I want to do something about. And it really affects him when when we have now a 1 in 30, if not more, rate of autism in children in our country. When he was growing up, it was 1 in 10,000, if that. So, he's fighting for the people here. And I hope more and more people come to realize it, and I hope that they can buy my book, The Real RFK Jr., Trials of a Truth Warrior, and learn more about him so that they can make an educated choice when it comes to voting.
And I would highly recommend it. It is in the description. It's on Audible. You truly have no excuse. You can turn it on and do laundry. There's no the impetus is there's no one to blame. You gotta listen to it. It's won me. I think the interview with Joe Rogan pretty much won me over, but this has won me over even more. And Mr. Russell, it's been an honor having you on, and I look forward to chatting with you again sometime.
Yeah, Tommy. Hey, I've really enjoyed it. And you're well read. I mean, you're fighting for the same things, and
I'm
your
trying.
generation, that's what your generation's got to do, man. And so more power to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Guys, thank you so much for listening. Again, please go into the description. Please go grab the book, listen to it, read about Bobby. And if you don't like him, at least have a reason for why you don't like him. Don't just take a headline from the news that says he's a bad guy. Go in and learn about him. And yeah, I think you'll be hard pressed to truly dislike the man. But do your research. And Mr. Russell, thank you so much, sir. And guys, thank you so much.